The sun was setting over the quiet town of Crestwood, Virginia, casting long shadows over the neatly manicured lawns and colonial-style homes. The air was thick with the scent of blooming magnolias, and the faint hum of cicadas filled the evening. But for Colonel Michael Grayson, the tranquility of his childhood home was shattered the moment he stepped out of his car. Michael had spent the last 3 decades serving in the United States Marine Corps. He had led missions in some of the most dangerous corners of the world, from the deserts of Iraq to the mountains of Afghanistan. He had seen the horrors of war up close, had lost friends in battle, and had carried the weight of command on his shoulders. But nothing could have prepared him for what he saw when he returned to Crestwood. The memorial was gone. For over 40 years, the stone monument had stood in the front yard of his family home. It was a tribute to his father, Captain Richard Grayson, and the men who had served alongside him in Vietnam. The names of the fallen were etched into the granite, a permanent reminder of their sacrifice. Every Memorial Day, veterans from across the county would gather there to pay their respects, to tell stories, and to honor the dead. Now, all that remained was a pile of rubble. Michael's boots crunched over the shattered pieces of granite as he approached the spot where the memorial had once stood. His chest tightened, and a wave of anger surged through him. His father had built that memorial with his own hands, carving each name with painstaking care. It had been more than just a monument. It had been a place of remembrance, of mourning, of honor. They did it, a voice whispered behind him. Michael turned to see his mother, Eleanor Grayson, standing on the porch. She was a small, frail woman, but her eyes were sharp with a quiet strength that had carried her through decades of hardship. She had been a Marine wife, enduring the long months of her husband's deployments, the years of uncertainty, and the funerals of friends who had never returned. She had held the family together with a resilience that demanded nothing and gave everything. Now, her hands were shaking as she clutched something tightly against her chest. Michael's stomach dropped when he recognized a folded American flag that had been given to her at his father's funeral. The flag that had rested on his casket as the bugle played taps. The flag she had kept on the mantel for years, too sacred to touch. "The HOA," she said, her voice raw with emotion. "They sent a letter last month saying it violated community guidelines. Then this morning, they just. Her voice broke, and Michael saw the depth of her grief not just for the destruction of the memorial, but for what it meant. The last piece of Richard Grayson, the last remnant of his service, had been erased as if it had never mattered. Michael's jaw clenched so hard he thought his teeth might break. Something boiled up inside him, something that had been drilled into his bones from the moment he first put on the uniform. It wasn't just anger, it was a fury deeper than rage. The kind of fury that didn't just demand revenge, but justice. Lawrence Dempsey was the kind of man who thrived on power without consequence. He had never held a rifle, never stood in a combat zone, never had to make a decision that determined whether another man lived or died. But he loved authority, not the kind earned through sweat and sacrifice, but the kind you could buy with a real estate license and a clipboard full of fines. Dempsey was in his late 50s, with a soft, round body that spoke of long lunches and zero discipline. His hair was thinning, but he covered it with a thick layer of greasy gel that smelled like a car dealership air freshener. His suit was expensive, his Rolex flashy, and his attitude a smug blend of self-importance and unchecked arrogance. As the president of the Crestwood Homeowners Association, Dempsey ruled the neighborhood like a third-world dictator. He wielded HOA bylaws like they were divine law, fining retirees for faded shutters and young couples for kids' bikes left on the lawn. He once threatened to sue a widow for planting sunflowers that weren't in accordance with the approved community aesthetic. He ruled through intimidation, knowing that most homeowners didn't have the time, money, or energy to fight back. But today, Dempsey had a real problem. Michael Grayson stormed through the glass doors of the HOA office, his boots pounding against the pristine, freshly waxed tile floors. Heads snapped up, a secretary flinched, and a board member glanced up from his phone before deciding to look busy. Michael wasn't here for a polite discussion. He shoved open Dempsey's office door without knocking, the force of it shaking the framed certificates on the wall. Dempsey, who had been lounging behind his overpriced mahogany desk, barely glanced up. He was flipping through a real estate contract, twirling a Mont-Blanc pen between his fingers like a man who believed his time was too valuable for petty homeowner complaints. Michael stood in front of the desk, feet planted wide, hands curled into fists at his sides. He didn't sit. He didn't blink. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "You bulldozed my father's memorial," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Dempsey let out a slow, dramatic sigh, finally deigning to look up. His eyes flicked to Michael's uniform, the ribbons, the badges, the rank insignia on his chest. And yet, there was no respect in his gaze, just mild inconvenience, as if a particularly annoying fly had buzzed into his office. "Ah, Grayson. Lot 34, Dempsey said, opening a manila folder and flipping through documents with calculated boredom. "Yes, we issued multiple warnings regarding the violation of HOA policies concerning non-conforming structures. Homeowners are not allowed to erect unsanctioned statues, large plaques, or—" Michael's fist slammed onto the desk with such force that Dempsey's water bottle tipped over, sending a flood across his pristine paperwork. Picture frames rattled, and a gold-plated pen holder hit the floor. Dempsey jumped. "You don't call a war memorial an unsanctioned statue," Michael said, his voice steady and dangerous. Dempsey swallowed hard, but only for a second. Then, like the weasel he was, he recovered. He straightened his tie, picked up his pen, and acted as if the giant in front of him hadn't just nearly shattered his desk in half. "Look, Mr. Grayson," Dempsey said smoothly, his voice dripping with condescension. "We have a duty to maintain property values. Your father's display was an eyesore. It was driving down home prices in the neighborhood. I understand your sentimental attachment, but rules are rules." Michael saw red. His jaw clenched so hard he thought his teeth might shatter. His fingers twitched, the way they used to in combat zones when the only thing stopping him from ending a threat was the rules of engagement. Dempsey leaned back, smirking now, as if he had already won. "You're welcome to take it up with our legal team," he said, so casually, so arrogantly, so stupidly. That was the moment Michael decided this was war. Michael Grayson had spent his entire life fighting for something bigger than himself. His service wasn't just about duty or honor or the stars and stripes stitched onto his uniform. It was about protection of his people, his country, his home. He had stood on the front lines so that men like Dempsey could enjoy their cushy suburban lives, so they could sleep soundly at night, never knowing the sacrifices that had been made for their comfort. And now, that same kind of mankind who had never seen war, never lost a brother in arms, never folded a flag for a grieving widow, thought he could erase his father's legacy with nothing more than a bulldozer and a smirk. Michael wasn't about to let that happen. He had spent decades in strategic operations, and he knew one thing for sure: you don't fight alone. Wars were never won by a single soldier, no matter how strong, no matter how skilled. They were won with an army. By the time the sun rose the next morning, Michael had won. First, the old guard. Michael started with the men who had served alongside his father, men who had fought in Vietnam, who had spilled blood in places where the jungle swallowed the dead whole. These were Marines, the kind who still stood shoulder to shoulder even after the years had stolen their youth, but not their fire. The kind who still carried their unit patches like badges of loyalty, who still called Richard Grayson brother, even in death. When Michael called, they didn't hesitate. Then, the next generation. Word spread like wildfire through the veteran community. Military families from the neighborhood, men and women who had served in Iraq, Afghanistan, Desert Storm, all rallied. Some were active duty, some were retired, but every single one of them understood the weight of what had been done. This wasn't just a memorial for one man. It was a tribute to all who had fallen. It was sacred ground. And when you desecrate sacred ground, you pay for it. Then, the big guns. Michael had spent years building relationships, earning respect in the Pentagon. He had leverage. There were favors owed, men in high places who had seen what he could do, men who trusted him. When he made the call to Colonel James Wallace, a high-ranking officer with enough pull to shake the chain of command, there wasn't a moment of hesitation. "I'll make some calls," Wallace said. And he did. By mid-morning, the media had the story. By mid-afternoon, it had gone national. By nightfall, it was an inferno. HOA bulldozes War Heroes Memorial. Family left devastated. The headline ran on every major news network: Fox, CNN, MSNBC. Local stations didn't matter, it was everywhere. Photos of the destroyed memorial flashed across screens nationwide. Images of veterans standing in front of the wreckage, saluting, their faces hard as stone. Clips of Michael's mother, Eleanor, clutching the folded flag, her voice breaking as she spoke about what had been lost. America was furious. People took to social media in waves tweets, Facebook posts, Instagram stories. Rage poured in from every direction. Who the hell do these HOA tyrants think they are? This is a disgrace. Our veterans deserve respect. What HOA thinks a war memorial is an eyesore? Fire them all. Then came the politicians. Congressmen and senators, both sides of the aisle, started calling for investigations. Governors weighed in. Local officials scrambled to distance themselves from the HOA's decision. Nobody wanted to be on the wrong side of this firestorm. And Dempsey? Oh, Dempsey was sweating now. His phone rang off the hook. His email inbox flooded with hate mail. His own board members, the same ones who had backed his every move, suddenly weren't so loyal. He had expected pushback from the family. He hadn't expected the wrath of the entire damn country. And the best part? Michael wasn't even close to finished. Michael didn't believe in half measures. When he went to war, he went to win. And this was war, a battle not fought with rifles and airstrikes, but with legal briefs and public humiliation. For this particular mission, he needed a specialist, a man who knew how to gut an opponent without ever throwing a punch. Enter Robert Bobby Langley. Bobby was a former Marine Corps JAG officer, a lawyer with a reputation for tearing bureaucratic cowards apart in the courtroom. He had the tenacity of a drill instructor and the kind of legal mind that could find a loophole in the damn Constitution if he had to. He didn't believe in settlement deals, didn't believe in amicable resolutions. If you screwed over a Marine's family, he came for blood. So when Michael called him and explained what the HOA had done, Bobby didn't ask questions. He just said, "I'll be there in 6 hours." And he was. By the next morning, Bobby Langley slammed a 100-page lawsuit onto the HOA's polished conference room table like a judge dropping a gavel. Lawrence Dempsey, still trying to pretend like he was in control, reached for the thick document with a smirk. That smirk didn't last. The charges were brutal: destruction of private property, violation of federal laws protecting war memorials, emotional distress inflicted on a military family. Dempsey's lips pressed into a thin line, but Bobby wasn't done. He leaned in, tapping one particular section of the document, his voice cold as steel. And here's the real kicker. Dempsey hesitated, his fingers twitching as he flipped the page. And then he saw a bombshell. HOA funds had been secretly used to hire the demolition crew without a proper board vote. That was illegal. The blood drained from Dempsey's face so fast, it was almost comical. See, a man like Dempsey was a cockroach in a tailored suit. He had built his kingdom by hiding behind rules and fine print, by making other people pay the price for his decisions. But this time he was the one holding the bag. Because the moment those HOA funds were used without a vote, the liability wasn't just on the HOA, it was on him. Personal liability. Fraud. Misappropriation of funds. Federal charges. Michael had seen hardened soldiers break under pressure. He had seen grown men collapse from fear in the middle of a firefight. And now, he saw that exact look in Dempsey's eyes, pure, unfiltered terror. Dempsey tried to open his mouth, tried to muster up some pathetic defense, but nothing came out. His tongue darted out, wetting his lips, and for the first time in his smug, useless life, he looked completely and utterly powerless. Michael didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He didn't even blink. He just leaned forward, met Dempsey's wide, panicked gaze, and said in a voice that could have frozen hell itself, "You thought you could bulldoze my father's memory and get away with it." A pause. A breath. Michael let his next words drop like a hammer. "You forgot who you were messing with." Dempsey wasn't the type to go down without a fight. Cowards never were. The moment he realized he was cornered, that the walls were closing in, he did what every spineless bureaucrat does when faced with consequences. He tried to lawyer his way out of it. Within 24 hours, he had assembled a team of high-powered attorneys, the kind who charged due law $1,000 an hour just to pick up the phone. These were the same legal sharks who had spent their careers helping HOAs crush homeowners with endless red tape, drowning them in fine print, fees, and legal loopholes until they gave up or went bankrupt. Dempsey thought that if he threw enough money and enough legal jargon at the problem, Michael would back off. He couldn't have been more wrong. Michael wasn't some retiree with a bad knee and a fixed income. He wasn't some suburban dad who'd get scared and settle out of court. He was a colonel in the United States Marine Corps, and the military had taught him a very simple lesson. If the enemy is trying to overwhelm you with sheer force, you don't fight harder. You fight smarter. While Dempsey's lawyers were burying themselves in legal strategy, Michael was burying Dempsey. Because here's the thing, Michael didn't just know how to fight. He knew how to mobilize. By the time Dempsey's legal team had finished drafting their first countermotion, Michael's contacts in the Pentagon had already ensured that every single military organization in the country knew what had happened. It started with the veterans. Emails went out to every VA office in the state, then to Marine Corps associations, Army retiree networks, and Air Force veteran support groups. Word spread fast. The same veterans who had once fought side by side with Richard Grayson, the same men who had lost brothers in combat, saw what had been done to his memorial and took it personally. Then came the politicians. A few congressmen, some veterans themselves, others just smart enough to recognize a PR disaster when they saw one started asking questions. One particularly fiery senator from Texas took to Twitter, calling the HOA's actions a blatant insult to every American who ever wore the uniform. It was a political nuke. No, why not? Even the most heartless bureaucrat wanted to be seen defending an organization that had bulldozed a war memorial. And then the generals got involved. Michael had spent years in the military. He had served under men who now sat at the highest levels of command. A few retired four-star generals, men with more medals than Dempsey, had excuses, started making phone calls of their own. And when they spoke, people listened. At this point, Dempsey knew he was losing. So he tried Plan B, media suppression. He called in favors, tried to con VYNC local news stations to stop running the story, sent out press releases painting the HOA as the victim of a misunderstood policy decision. He even hired a PR firm to rewrite the narrative, framing the destruction of the memorial as a regrettable but necessary enforcement of community standards. It didn't work. Not when national news had already picked up the story. Not when veterans were holding protests in front of the HOA offices, standing at attention in full uniform, saluting the wreckage. Not when VY Deos of Dempsey looking like a deer in the headlights during HOA meetings were circulating online, with millions of angry Americans demanding justice. Dempsey was running out of moves. That's when he resorted to desperation. He tried to scare Michael off, filed a counter-lawsuit for defamation, threatened to sue for emotional distress, tried to claim that Michael was inciting harassment by mobilizing the public. Michael's response: a cold, quiet laugh. Dempsey might have thought he was fighting a homeowner, but Michael was a soldier. And if there was one thing Michael knew how to do better than anyone, it was how to break an enemy's will to fight. Because while Dempsey was wasting time on his pathetic counterattacks, Michael had already delivered the kill shot. The HOA bore the same group of power-hungry nobodies that had once backed Dempsey, without question had turned against him. At first, they had been arrogant, standing beside their leader, believing that the controversy would blow over. But now they were watching the public outrage grow. Now they were watching local businesses cut ties with the HOA. Now they were watching their own homes become targets of protests. And now they were watching their personal bank accounts shrink. Because while Dempsey was busy playing legal chess, Michael had been playing financial warfare. A few carefully placed calls to local businesses, real estate groups, and state officials had completely tanked property values in Crestwood. Realtors were avoiding the neighborhood like the plague, knowing that no one wanted to buy a home in a place where HOA dictators tore down war memorials. And when home values drop, HOA fees drop. And when HOA fees drop, board members panic. By the end of the week, an emergency HOA board meeting was called. Dempsey walked in with confidence and walked out unemployed. Unanimous vote. They had kicked him out. The same people who had once treated him like a king had thrown him to the wolves. And Michael? Michael watched it all unfold with the cold satisfaction of a man who knew that justice wasn't given. It was taken. Dempsey thought he could fight his way out of this. He thought that with the right lawyers, the right PR spin, and enough stall tactics, he could salvage his reputation, keep his power, and walk away unscathed. He was dead wrong. By the time the HOA board threw him out, he was already bleeding credibility. But what happened next? That was the death blow. The lawsuit wasn't just about money. It was about making an example out of him. Michael and Bobby Langley had been relentless, pushing the case forward with the precision of a military strike. Every deposition, every court filing, every legal maneuver dug the hole deeper and deeper. And then the board cracked. At first, the HOA had tried to fight tooth and nail, throwing up every legal defense they could find. But lawyers are expensive. And when homeowners started refusing to pay their HOA fees, the financial situation collapsed fast. The association was hemorrhaging money. And in the end, they caved. They settled. Michael didn't even have to step into a courtroom. But by then, it was already too late for Dempsey. The settlement was brutal. First, the money. The HOA had to pay out hundreds of thousands in damages compensation for the destruction of private property, emotional distress, and punitive fines for their illegal use of funds. The association's finances were in ruins. And the board members who had once backed Dempsey's every decision, they weren't sticking around to fix it. Resignations flooded in. Board members jumped ship, desperate to distance themselves from the disaster Dempsey had created. But for Dempsey himself, the reckoning wasn't over. The Real Estate Commission had been watching. See, Dempsey didn't just run an HOA. He was a real estate agent, a man who depended on his license to maintain the lifestyle he had grown so fond of. A man who had made his fortune convincing people to buy homes under the very HOA he had now destroyed. And when the commission reviewed his actions, the financial mismanagement, the fraudulent use of HOA funds, the national outrage, they pulled the trigger. Dempsey's real estate license was revoked for life. That meant no more commissions, no more property deals, no more paychecks with six figures. The career he had spent decades building was gone just like that. And yet, that still wasn't the worst of it. Because while Dempsey was watching his empire burn, Michael was building something bigger. The outrage had reached Congress. Veterans groups weren't just angry, they were mobilized. Letters were sent. Calls were made. And before long, a bill was introduced in the House of Representatives, a new federal law that would prevent any HOA from ever demolishing a war memorial again. A law that would ensure that what happened to the Grayson Memorial would never happen anywhere else in the country. And that was something permanent. But for Michael, none of that mattered as much as what came next. Because more important than the lawsuits, the media firestorm, or the legislative victories he had won was something even greater: the right to rebuild. The permits were signed. The land was cleared. The green light was given. Richard Grayson's war memorial was coming back. And this time, no one would ever be able to touch it again. 1 month later, the new Richard Grayson War Memorial stood tall, bigger, stronger, untouchable. It wasn't just a tribute anymore. It was a declaration. A message to everyone who thought history could be erased with a bulldozer. A warning to those who believed sacrifice could be measured in property values. This memorial wasn't just for Richard Grayson anymore. It was for every soldier who had been forgotten, every veteran who had been dismissed, every family who had lost someone and was told to move on. The crowd stretched far beyond what anyone had expected. Veterans in full dress uniforms stood at attention, their shoulders squared, their eyes locked on the memorial with the quiet reverence of men who understood loss more than most ever would. Families held on to old photos, their fingers tracing the edges as if touching the past. Reporters captured every moment, but for once, the cameras didn't matter. This was bigger than headlines. The national anthem played, and a hush fell over the crowd. Flags rippled in the light breeze, the only sound beyond the slow, steady crackle of salutes being raised in unison. Michael stood at the front, his own medals catching the sunlight, a silent testament to the battles he had fought, both abroad and at home. His mother, standing beside him, held the folded flag that had once covered his father's casket. Her grip was firm, her shoulders trembling just slightly, but her chin was raised. She had spent her life standing by a soldier. Today, she stood by too. She turned to Michael, her voice soft but unwavering. He would have been proud. Michael's jaw tightened. He didn't need to answer. He didn't need to explain what his father would have thought. He knew. He had felt it in every step of this fight, in every name carved deep into that stone, in every moment justice had been restored. His eyes didn't leave the memorial as he spoke, his voice steady, certain, unshakable. He is. The memorial wasn't just a rebuilding. It was a message etched into stone, reinforced with steel, and built from the rubble of arrogance. It wasn't just about restoring what was lost. It was about making damn sure it would never be lost again. This wasn't just about Michael Grayson's father. It wasn't just about the names carved into the granite, the men who had fought and died, the brothers in arms who never made it home. It was about something bigger, deeper, permanent. It was a message to every soldier who had ever put on the uniform, every Marine, every airman, every sailor, every warrior who had signed their name on the dotted line, knowing they might never come back. It was a message to those who had bled on foreign soil, who had slept in trenches, who had watched their best friends die right in front of them. A message that said, "You are not forgotten. You will never be forgotten." It was a message to the families who had sacrificed just as much, to the mothers and fathers who had stood in silence as officers knocked on their doors with news that shattered their world. To the widows who had accepted a folded flag and a scripted "thank you" in exchange for the love of their life. To the children who had grown up with empty chairs at the dinner table, with stories instead of memories, with photos instead of hugs. It was a message to every generation who came after, every young boy or girl who would one day walk past that stone and ask, who were they? And the answer would be there, carved into history, immovable. And it was a message to the bureaucrats, the cowards, the paper pushers who thought they could make history disappear just because it wasn't convenient. This was for every HOA tyrant, every city official, every smug little man in a suit who believed rules and policies were more important than blood and sacrifice. For the kind of people who had never served a day in their life but thought they had the right to decide which sacrifices were worth remembering. It was a monumental reminder that some things are not up for debate, that patriotism isn't seasonal, that service isn't temporary, and that honor doesn't expire just because someone thinks it ruins their neighborhood's curb appeal. The HOA thought they were dealing with just another homeowner, some civilian, some retiree who would get angry, threaten to sue, and then let it go. They thought they could steamroll over a grieving family, reduce a man's legacy to a pile of rubble, and face no consequences. They thought wrong. They weren't dealing with just another homeowner. They were dealing with a colonial, a man who had spent his entire life fighting for his country, for his people, for justice. A man who didn't back down, didn't quit, and didn't lose. A man who understood that when something sacred is attacked, you don't ask for permission to fight back. You take the fight straight to their doorstep. And now that fight was over. And the colonel had won. If you were the one in this story, how would you react? Would you stand up and fight back, or accept the unreasonable pressure and control from the HOA? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video with more people. Your small action gives us the motivation to keep bringing you more intense and engaging stories. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.